May 22nd, 2013 began like any ordinary day in southeast London. Traffic moved slowly past Woolwich Barracks as rain gathered on the pavement. Within moments, that familiar street would become the focus of breaking news worldwide. A young soldier, Lee Rigby, lost his life in an attack that stunned Britain. Bystanders filmed what they saw, their footage racing through phones and social feeds before police arrived. What unfolded changed the nation's sense of safety, forcing investigators, journalists, and citizens to confront a new question: how do we witness tragedy in real time? On the morning of May 22, 2013, London moved at its usual pace. Commuters hurried through Woolwich Arsenal Station, umbrellas folding and opening under a low gray sky. Among them was Lee Rigby, a 25-year-old drummer from the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers. He was returning to Woolwich Barracks after duty at the Tower of London, dressed in a Help for Heroes sweatshirt, earphones in. Phone in hand shortly before 3 p.m. CCTV captured him walking along Artillery Place, a short stretch of shops and cafes bordering the barracks. Traffic moved normally. Drizzle slicked the pavement into a mirror of headlights. Nothing about the footage suggested the street would soon enter national history. Minutes later, emergency dispatchers began receiving fragmented calls about an incident outside the barracks. Police and medics were sent immediately. By 3:10 p.m., armed officers had sealed the road in both directions, and paramedics stood by, waiting for clearance to reach the scene within 20 minutes. The first videos recorded by witnesses were circulating online. Hashtags appeared on Twitter before any official statement. The Metropolitan Police confirmed only that a soldier had been killed, and that counter-terrorism officers were assuming control by evening. Satellite trucks lined the narrow street. Reporters spoke beneath umbrellas as investigators worked behind blue and white tape. Across Britain, television anchors repeated the same phrase: a murder in broad daylight on a London street. That night, Prime Minister David Cameron returned to London and addressed the nation. This was not just an attack on one soldier. It was an attack on everyone in our country. Candlelight vigils formed outside barracks and in Manchester, where Lee Rigby had grown up. Flowers covered the gates of his regiment. For a generation raised on distant headlines, the violence of that afternoon brought terror into familiar daylight. A suburban street had become a symbol of grief, courage, and the fragility of ordinary peace. Within minutes of the emergency calls, armed response units were racing through southeast London. Traffic halted as blue lights converged on Artillery Place. At 3:10 p.m., police arrived to a scene already frozen in shock. Two men stood nearby, still at the center of what witnesses had filmed moments earlier. Officers ordered them to drop their weapons. When they advanced instead, shots were fired. Both men were wounded and taken alive into custody under armed guard. The suspects were later identified as Michael Adebolayo and Michael Adebowale, British citizens who claimed political and religious motives. Detectives from the Metropolitan Police Counter-Terrorism Command took charge of the case. The area remained sealed through the night as forensic teams collected evidence from the street. Nearby vehicles and surveillance cameras. Across Britain, shock turned into disbelief. Parliament held an emergency session while mosques and churches issued joint statements condemning the violence. Online hashtags calling for unity trended alongside messages of anger and grief. The footage that had spread so fast was now being used by investigators to reconstruct the timeline second by second. By the following morning, senior officers briefed reporters. Both suspects were in hospital under police guard. No other attackers were involved. The Home Secretary described the killing as an assault on the British way of life, while the mayor of London called it a tragedy carried out in the full glare of the modern world. For residents of Woolwich, the street outside the barracks became a vigil sight flowers, flags and handwritten notes lining the curb. For investigators, it became a symbol of a new challenge, crimes committed not in secret, but in front of millions of screens. In the days following the Woolwich attack, detectives from Scotland Yard's Counter-Terrorism Command began a nationwide inquiry named Operation Tempra. They traced the suspects' movements, communications, and financial history. Dozens of witnesses were interviewed, and hundreds of hours of CCTV were reviewed frame by frame. Evidence technicians collected clothing, vehicles, and electronic devices from addresses across London and Luton. Digital forensics revealed online conversations referencing extremist material, showing both men had been monitored previously by MI5. Parliamentary hearings later confirmed that intelligence officers had encountered them during separate investigations, but had not considered them an imminent threat. The revelation reignited a public debate over surveillance, privacy, and prevention. By late May 2013, both men were charged with murder and possession of firearms with intent. Their trial was scheduled at the Old Bailey in central London, one of the country's most secure courts. Proceedings began in November 2013. Under heavy police presence inside, jurors saw CCTV timelines, phone records, and eyewitness testimony describing the aftermath rather than the act itself. The defendants did not deny involvement. Instead, they framed their actions as political protest. The prosecution called it a deliberate killing designed to instill fear. After 3 weeks of evidence, the jury returned unanimous guilty verdicts. In February 2014, the court sentenced Michael Adebayo to life imprisonment without parole and Michael A.D. Bale to life with a minimum term of 45 years. Outside, crowds gathered behind barriers, some carrying flowers, others holding flags. Reporters spoke over the sound of church bells echoing from nearby St. Paul's Cathedral. For the public, the trial closed a legal chapter, but not the emotional one. It forced the nation to confront radicalization born at home, spread online, and acted out in daylight a crime that blurred the line between personal belief and public terror. The trial's verdict did not end the story across Britain. The Woolwich attack became a mirror reflecting questions about identity, community, and fear. Vigils continued long after sentencing. Flowers outside the barracks were replaced weekly by strangers who had never met Lee Rigby. His regiment established a memorial fund for veterans and their families, turning grief into quiet service. At the same time, the case reignited debate over radicalization. News programs analyzed how 2 men born in London could reach such violent conviction. Government ministers launched new initiatives under the Prevent strategy, aimed at identifying early signs of extremist ideology in schools and online spaces. Community leaders described the approach as necessary, but warned against suspicion becoming policy. In media classrooms and journalism panels, Woolwich was discussed as a turning point. It had been one of the first attacks witnessed through social media in real time, a moment when ordinary citizens became broadcasters without realizing it. The footage that once shocked the nation was now studied in ethics seminars, a case study in how information moved faster than verification. Faith leaders across the UK united in condemnation, holding interfaith prayers in London. Birmingham and Manchester, they emphasized that ideology, not religion, had driven the act. "We stand together against hate," one imam said outside a mosque in East London, surrounded by reporters and parish priests. Years later, when the memorial to Lee Rigby was unveiled, veterans stood shoulder to shoulder with civilians. The sound of drums echoed softly across Woolwich Common, a reminder of the young soldiers' regiment. For a moment the city fell silent, not out of fear, but remembrance. The attack had ended in minutes. Its echo would shape Britain for a generation. In the decade that followed, the Woolwich attack came to represent more than an act of terror. It marked that moment when violence entered the social media age, when information traveled faster than institutions could respond. Investigators later said they learned almost as much from citizen footage as from CCTV. It was the first time Scotland Yard requested full digital uploads from the public to build an official timeline. Technology firms began working with law enforcement to manage the flood of real-time evidence. Platforms quietly rewrote their moderation policies, developing tools to suppress violent imagery before it spread. The balance between transparency and sensitivity became a new ethical frontier. At journalism schools, the case became required study. Professors replayed the sequence of events to teach how digital witnessing could distort collective memory. Viewers scrolling through short clips saw chaos without context proof that in an algorithmic world, emotion travels faster than facts. Lawmakers also looked to Woolwich when drafting the Online Safety Act, legislation that strengthened obligations for companies to remove extremist material. Civil rights advocates warned against overreach, but few denied that Britain had crossed into a new era. The camera was now both witness and weapon. Meanwhile, Lee Rigby's family used the same digital platforms to build something different. The Lee Rigby Foundation began supporting veterans with trauma recovery programs, online counseling, and remembrance events streamed worldwide. Their approach turned the same networks that once broadcast grief into tools for healing. Today, researchers still cite Woolwich as the event that changed how nations process public violence, an inflection point where technology forced society to look inward. For every second of footage uploaded, it asked a question. When everyone can record tragedy, who decides how it should be remembered? More than a decade later, the name Woolwich still carries weight. It reminds Britain of the afternoon when one street, one soldier, and two men changed the nation's understanding of extremism. Yet it also marks how communities chose to answer violence with remembrance, not revenge. Every year, veterans and civilians gather outside Woolwich Barracks, the memorial stone engraved with Lee Rigby. 1987 to 2013 is polished before the ceremony begins. The service is brief, a drum roll, a prayer, a minute of silence. His family rarely speaks publicly now. They let the foundation continue his work in quiet ways, funding mental health projects and youth outreach programs that bridge military and civilian life. In classrooms, Woolwich appears in lessons on media literacy and counter-radicalization. Students discuss how ordinary witnesses shaped the narrative long before headlines did. The event has become less about the violence itself and more about how a society processes trauma in real time. The police reforms that followed still influence Britain's response to lone actor threats. Intelligence agencies now cooperate more closely across departments, balancing vigilance with transparency. Parliament's reports call Woolwich a case study in modern prevention. But beyond policy, the story endures because of what it revealed about human connection. Thousands of people who never met Lee Rigby sent letters, flowers, or quiet prayers for a moment. A divided nation found unity in mourning today. The scar left on Artillery Place has softened. Buses still pass. Children walk to school. And the drizzle returns each spring. Yet for those who stop at the memorial, the sound of traffic fades and the silence speaks louder than any broadcast ever could. Woolwich is no longer just a place where something ended. It is where Britain learned how to remember. If you thought the horror ended here, you're wrong. What other dark rituals and forbidden practices are still being performed in secret? Dive deeper into the chilling world of haunted ceremonies, banned footage, and eerie folklore that refuses to stay buried. Click on the playlist to uncover terrifying recordings, lost evidence, and disturbing stories they never wanted you to see. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for weekly uploads of spine-tingling footage and dark tales that echo from the shadows. This is the Forbiddance Archive, where the hidden truth and haunting evidence come to life.